Hello,
Good
welcome
morning.
to Living Waters, falling deeper in love with God's Word. And I am one of your hosts, Stephanie Pavlantos.
And I am your other host, Lauren Cruz. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning to everyone. And today we are starting Lauren's book, Strength of a
Mhm.
Woman, Why You Are Proverbs 31.
That's
So
right.
it's exciting. We're going to learn a couple of letters of the alphabet as well as we go through
Right.
this. So it's very good.
Right. So we are actually going to just jump into the first two chapters. And so if you are brand new to watching this, we're working through the book. We're going to do about 2 chapters a week or so. So that'll get us through in about 11 or 12 weeks. And it looks at Proverbs 31 as an acrostic poem of the Hebrew alphabet. And so that's what we mean by the letters, because if you look at Proverbs 31 verses 10 through 31 in the original Hebrew, the first letter of every verse starts with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And so it triggers, and we're looking at the Paleo Hebrew, where we had images that relate to those letters. And so the images and the language and words in the verses are used to memorize it. And so this is advice from a mom to a son. This is the kind of woman you want to find. Memorize this. And so as an acrostic poem, it would have been easier to memorize. There would have been memory triggers in there for him to remember this is the kind of woman to find. So we're going
Very
to.
interesting.
So we're going to look at the first verse, and I think, good morning. I see people jumping
Yep.
on. I'm so
I see
excited to
people
have you
jumping
guys.
on.
So
Good morning, Lori. Good morning, Shonda. Thank
good
you.
morning. Yeah, and so I'm going to ask you, our viewers today, before I even get started in explaining anything else, what are your thoughts, or what do you know about Proverbs 31? Or when you hear that passage in today's time, what usually goes through your mind when you hear about that? Is she
Yeah.
good or bad? Like, are you happy to hear about it, or you roll your eyes and think, oh no, not again?
Overachiever, I think.
Overachiever. I mean, truly, yeah. Tired.
Yeah, I think tired. It's like I've got enough on my plate with that. I mean, my husband and I actually do have a garden, and we do have animals, and I help him, but he does a whole lot about it. So
yeah.
But here's a few comments. Lori said, "I've heard that it was written by a man."
Yeah.
And
I'm happy about
yes,
it.
Shonda
Okay.
is happy. So
Yeah, and Lori, I guess that's written by a man because Proverbs, a lot of it is King Solomon, and so, and the thinking is King Lemuel is the words of King Lemuel as spoken by his mom, and so the tradition is that they think that King Lemuel might have been Solomon, and so he's right, like, hey, my mom told me this, and so let me write this down. And it's also a bookend. The first few verses of Proverbs says the beginning of the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and then all of Proverbs is personified as Lady Wisdom. And then here at the end, we have, a woman who is described as a wise woman. And so, it's like the bookend. So yeah,
and this
Lori,
is sorry.
always listen to. I was just Lori says always listen to mom. Yes, always
Yeah.
listen to your mother.
And I bring up the fact that this is always used every Shabbat, right?
It is on Friday night when Shabbat is started. Hebrew men sing the Woman of Valor song to their wives and to the women and daughters. And I have attended a messianic service where the women were placed in the middle of a circle and the men surrounded them and spoke this over them, and it was incredible because sadly a lot of ladies in the church look at her and think she's exhausting, she's a standard, I can't live up to her. But Jewish women don't necessarily look at her that way. They look at her as a woman of honor, like this is a great thing. And they're told every Friday night, you are this
Right.
you are this woman, you are this woman. So
Right.
it's very interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
let me start by reading. I'm just going to read the first 2 verses because that's all we're going to cover today. We've got a whole hour and hopefully a whole lot of information to get into. But this is specifically Proverbs 31, starting in verse 10. An excellent wife who can find, for her worth is far above jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. And so that is the first 2 verses. The first verse actually begins with the letter Aleph in the word Ishet, which is woman. So we read it a woman of excellence or a woman of valor or a woman of a virtuous woman. There's a variety of translations depending on what translation you read. But in Hebrew, it actually says a woman of strength. The word valor, excellence, virtuous is the word chayil in Hebrew. And it is the word strength or mighty. If you go back and read the description of David's mighty men, it's the same word, chayil. And last week I mentioned that there are 2 main themes for the Proverbs 31 passage. One is a military theme, and it is a military hymn, heroic hymn. And then the other is the priestly duties in the tabernacle is another theme. And so I'll just kind of ask you, keep that in the back of your mind so that as we encounter various words in the passage, just see, does that fulfill a military theme or a priestly theme? And so chayil is definitely a military word. It is a word that is always used to describe armies. It's a word to describe a warrior. So I think that's where they got the word valor, a woman of valor, because soldiers would have been described as men of valor.
Right.
And if you think about when the King James Bible was translated into English, think of the timing and how women were treated and how women were thought of. I can have virtuous women. I can have women of excellence. I could even have a woman of valor, but I couldn't have a woman of strength, right? Because women were very much property and possession and second-class citizens. And so even in the King James time when it was translated into English, I can't have women of strength. I could have women of excellence. And so I think that's where we get the little bit of change in our translations.
Which is a shame.
It is. I'm trying to read through some of our comments. Yeah.
Oh, I'm not getting many. Are you getting a lot of comments?
A few. Yeah, we've got a couple of Facebook users. And I'm sad. When you comment through our Facebook page, I don't always get your names. So somebody's cooking soup. So hello and thanks for joining us. So I think that's where some of the translation, lost in translation. But chayil is actually one of those references to military. And there's 7 references to her strength throughout the passage. So there's definitely, definitely some other areas of strong and strength. And this is not, a timid woman or just a busy woman. Aleph is the first letter, like we mentioned, and Aleph has the image of an ox. And so you can maybe begin to see some of the links there. So Aleph, okay, I got to remember that I need to find a woman as strong as an ox. That might be something to think about because oxen are strong, right? Oxen are also animals of service, right? And as women, aren't we service oriented for our families? And something else about oxen, they were the animal that was used as the sacrificial animal, especially for the Day of Atonement. And so, as women, do we not sacrifice for our family? You know, we definitely. And so it might be easy to think of like, oh, go find a woman that's strong as an ox, but that's not necessarily the lesson. What else do we know about oxen? think through that. How do they usually work?
In pairs.
They do. They work in pairs. And so they are yoked together. And so this mom is saying, son A, number one, because don't forget too, the Hebrew letters are a numbering system. So number one, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to find a woman of strength, but it's because you two are yoking together. You're going to yoke together. You're going to form a pair. You're going to need to plow together and to work together. And, that becomes the united joining of a family and of a marriage.
Right.
The other thing, and I probably should have noticed this too, whenever we read the Old Testament, I always like to ask, how does it point to Yeshua and how does it point to his grace? So even Proverbs 31 is pointing to Yeshua and his grace in some way. And so I'll ask you guys, in reading that, how does that point to a relationship with Yeshua? What do we see even in that process of yoking? How does that help us understand Yeshua? So I'll pause and see if any of our listeners want to take a guess.
I think it's important, and while they're writing something down, hopefully,
Yeah.
I think it's important to always look for Yeshua in Scripture, because even though it may be Old Testament Scripture, there are shadows and types that where he is, and so it's important to.
Well, and we read in the New Testament that even he didn't have the New Testament, right? And he, even starting with the prophets and starting with the scriptures, he began to explain, you know, himself. He revealed himself. And so, the Proverbs is part of the writings. And so somewhere in there, he is revealed. So I have a Facebook user that says yoking together with our Lord. So yeah. And even Jesus says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And I call the book Strength of a Woman, but really when I sign somebody's book, people say, please sign my book. I always say his strength, because it's not necessarily our strength. It's the strength that we receive by yoking ourselves to him. So
good point.
Yeah. So I definitely talk about yoking. Like, number one, we're going to yoke ourselves to our husbands, but also we're yoking ourselves to Yeshua. And it is a picture of, if this is going to be, and I'll honor this, it is a picture of marriage. A lot of people say, how can I be a Proverbs 31 if I'm not married, or I'm a widow, or I'm divorced, or I don't have children? I have a story in here of a lady who chooses not to have children and by choice. How can I be a Proverbs 31 woman? That's all this is about, right? Is a marriage. Well, take it from there and put it into the context of the bride of Christ and the churches, the church is being the bride of Christ. And so, even the church is yoking themselves to the bridegroom, Jesus. Right. And so I actually had a great sermon at church this week. It said, look at the overarching view. So the overarching view would be, how does the church relate? And then look at the personal view. How do I relate? I'm yoking myself to Yeshua. And then look at the historical view. This is a yoking of a man and a wife. So I think there's some great layers.
And I have heard, and it may have even been you who told me, but the yoke is also his teaching, the Torah.
Right.
Right. So when he says that his yoke is light, it's not a burden,
It's
because
not a burden.
his teaching is not a burden.
Right.
Now, what he does refer to is the burden of the Pharisees and the rabbis who added more on top.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and something that's interesting, I think I put this in the book, is when two oxen were yoked together, they would often put a stronger, more experienced ox with a younger, not necessarily weaker ox, but less experienced or a smaller one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they trained them. Like they would join them so that the less experienced one would learn so that it could be used in another yoking for another partnership. And so, think of that with the Holy Spirit and with Christ. He is our strength and he is our teacher. And you can't pull against the team has to work together. The husband and wife have to work together. I did put this in the book. Otherwise it's a zigzag, right? I mean, the goal is to get a straight line of plow, but if they're pulling against each other, and it hurts, like when the yoke is on and an oxen pulls away from that yoke, it hurts them. Yeah. And so there's definitely some good pictures.
Being in a kayak with your husband also is kind of like being yoked.
Yes, it is. We kayak.
You can go all over the place because you're both paddling. Like, I want to go over here. No.
I get in a different boat. I don't even want to be in the same boat. I want a separate boat because it's easier than working with him.
I know. And isn't that funny? Because I mean, I'm the same way now, but before we used to just get one, and it was always like, he's just like, we cannot work together in this. And I go, I guess not.
No.
And so, but Lori brings up, to be serious, Lori brings up a good point that we can be involved in the lives of other children.
Very much so.
Even if we don't have our own children, if we're not married, we can learn to mentor others. We can work in the children's department. There's lots we can do.
It's not even children, Lori. It's your whole circle of influence. Like, who's it's your spiritual family. It's your whole circle of influence. Like, I'm a public school teacher. I don't have kids I'm an empty nester. And so I don't, although I have children and I'm still a part of their lives, I have influence in how I treat 125 kids that I come in contact with each day. I can influence them so subtly in how I pour into them. So it's not necessarily your flesh and blood children. It's definitely how you pour into others. And I'll give you a spoiler. My friend who had no children, she poured into the moms, because how often as moms do we need help, or people are so quick to love on those kids, but like, we need help sometimes, so she definitely poured into mom. So so yoking. So Aleph is the ox, and the first memory trigger is to yoke ourselves. I'm sorry, while I'm shifting around, yoke ourselves to our husbands, but also to yoke ourselves to Yeshua. But there's also some other interesting words in there too. Who can find, right? That's one of the things, who can find. So that indicates a few things. So
can I go back to something before we go there?
Yeah.
So sorry, I had this starred and underlined, and right there on page 3, you have that the focus of this woman is manifested in her focus, or manifested in her focus on God. So that's the important part of what you're saying here. And you just said the woman described is not an overbearing woman with a strong personality who wields her control over others for her advantage. This behavior does not illustrate a woman of strength and value. Instead, this woman understands she must live yoked to God, which you did say already, but I thought that, we talked about what she is, but what she isn't is an overpowering, strong woman who wants her way and has to be right and needs everybody to fall in line behind her. So,
and I think that's very important, because there is a different, like, I do consider myself as having a strong personality, right? And I'm my kids would say I'm even probably bossy, and and I will be honest, I was a control freak. I very much was a control freak. But you have to learn to temper that, and that's not the goal here. Is not to be the control freak. Mm-hmm. The goal is to be the partner. The goal is not to pull away from that yoke. It's to work within the yoke. Mm-hmm. And I always hear of they use the dunamos, power under control. It's kind of like that. It's the power under control. Yeah. So I was going to mention that, who can find. So in the ancient Near East, it's very custom, very tradition. The culture is that you would pay a bride price, right? There was very much arranged marriages. That was very common. And they would pay a bride price. And so if you were fortunate enough to find a woman of strength and to find a woman that you were going to marry, you would pay a bride price. And it kind of referenced that a little bit. It said, she's valuable more than jewels. You're going to pay a price for her. You're going to find the jewels and pay for her. And so how is Messiah revealed even in that? I think of 1 Corinthians 6:20, for you have been bought with a price, and I even look at the words, she is more valuable than jewels. If you look up that word jewels in the Hebrew, it's the Hebrew word, and I'm going to hope I say it right, penyin. And when I looked up that word, it's usually translated as coral. In different translations, it's jewels, rubies. A lot of times it'll say she's valuable more than rubies, but it's coral, and it's specifically because little round red objects. And so some people have taken it to mean rubies. And I thought, when I read that, and this is completely, and I say this in the book, when I read that, little round red objects really, if I'm looking for Messiah, completely makes me think of the blood shed for me. That's the price that was paid for me. That's, I have been bought with a price. I have been bought with the round red drops of blood that have been shed for me. So that is the penyin that Christ shed for me. And it's interesting. I think I say this, I don't know if it's in this chapter or later. Wisdom and this woman are the only two things that are worth more than jewels, more than this. So I think it's very interesting. She is considered a wise woman. You're worth it. You're so worth it. So being,
and we were talking before about this, when you started talking about who can find, and I think you go on about it, right? Is that in a different chapter? Is that the next chapter that you talk about that they were a man if they,
oh yeah, I think the second chapter where she needs to go look for a treasure. Yeah, he is too. So in Hebrew thinking, a man was not fully a man. I think it might have been this chapter. A man is not fully a man until he is married, right? Until then, he's just a kid, I guess you could consider that. And so finding a wife was like seeking a treasure, and he was to look for her as if he was seeking a treasure. And so who can find, a virtuous woman? You need to go find this woman. And I guess that's a really good lesson for us today, male or female, is when we're looking for that spouse, we consider it as if we're looking for a treasure, and don't necessarily settle, or don't overlook those red flags, or don't think even like I'm expected to get married, not unless I can find that treasure that God is blessing me with. So,
and when I read stuff from David Foreman, who he's a rabbi, but he is he's excellent in explaining Old Testament, of course, but he puts things so well. When he was talking about Adam and Eve, he was talking about, since Eve is taken from Adam, I want to make sure I get the right order.
Right.
He's taken out of Adam, that it's more like she is, that Adam had, and again, this is Hebrew thinking. This is not what we learn in Sunday school, but but Adam was full of the DNA for both men and women. He was full of everything that God needed to make another person, to make the whole human race. So she's literally taken out of him, not just a rib. It's actually his whole side. It actually refers to. But my point being is that men are always looking for that which was taken from them. And this is a Hebrew way of thinking, a tradition that from now on, men are looking for what was taken out of them, where women aren't, in the sense that they didn't have that taken. So they serve out of the fullness that they have. And so they serve others, they serve their husbands, because the Lord has filled them. And I thought that was also very beautiful. That, and I actually told this to my husband, and he totally agreed. He's like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I never thought of it that way.
Right. I think that's a great segue, because in the chapters, I do put a few questions. And if you guys want to type in your responses, great. But, these are things to think about. How would you define, as wives and women, how would you define your life of service? Because if Aleph is the memory trigger and we represent Aleph, then we represent lives of service, sacrifice, and strength. So how would you define your life of service? And so, I definitely I serve my family. I serve in church. I serve the kids that I teach in the public school.
And we serve as Bible study teachers, and we serve, I don't know. I mean, I have to say, this is embarrassing, but when I did a personality and gifts type of testing, my service was kind of low because my teaching was pretty high. But it's funny how that works. But people who are true servants, it's so obvious when they are, they're a different kind of person.
Very much so.
But it's a good thing.
And then, in what ways do you sacrifice for others? And does it leave? And so this could be a good question, like, is this a gift or not? Because does it leave you feeling used or satisfied? Because a lot of times, if you're serving and you're feeling used and unsatisfied, then, that's kind of like, well, that's not, it's a good way of noticing if it's your giftedness or not. And so sacrifice, I think, as moms, we totally sacrifice.
Right.
Sacrifice everything as moms. My daughter, she's getting it now that she has a kid, but I would say and do things for her. Or I would say, like I gave up my career. I have a college degree and gave up careers. And she's like, well, you signed up for it, as a way of saying, like, you chose to have kids, but now she's making hard decisions, like how does she want to change her career because of kids that she had. And I'm like, I think you understand now what you were saying to me. And she's like, yeah, I really do. So it's a difference. It's a sacrifice. And what strength do you add to your family? And I think that's a good question, because we all have strengths that we truly add to our family. And so
sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, it's something to celebrate.
My daughter is out of the country serving, and she sent me a message last night that they were having a Zoom thing about teaching, or Zoom teaching, I should say, and it was on spiritual warfare. And especially when you're in countries around the world that might be very close to believers, and there's a lot of spiritual warfare that goes on because these countries are like, no, we don't want you in here. So, but she said, all the things that he was talking about, she was kind of, to paraphrase, this was like listening to you. It's like listening to me, and I go, kind of like made you feel like you were at home, huh? And she's like, yeah, kind of did. But I thought that was funny, and I thought it related to what you're saying, because my kids know she has come to me with questions when she has to lead a study. Now she comes to me with questions because she knows this is my thing, this is what I love, and this is what I impressed upon them. So now she in her, she's 26 and now she's getting it.
They get it. Yeah, they get it. So it's interesting too, spiritual warfare. We talked about this having a military theme. And honestly, there's a lot of undercurrents of spiritual warfare. Like if we're fighting for our families. We are on the front lines. Then think about how a wife and a mother is for her husband and for her kids and for our circle of influence. If we don't have a husband and kids, we're on the front lines. And
right.
So,
Very much so.
Yeah. All right. So bait, that's the second one. Bait is the next one. And it is the heart of her husband trusts in her and he will have no gains. And the word gains is another military term. It's the term of, plunder. He'll have no plunder. It means he doesn't have to go out and fight anywhere else because there's nothing else to search and gain from anybody else because everything she does, she provides for him. She, anything he could possibly seek somewhere else, she's able to get. This one, the heart is really the trigger. It starts with the word batach, which is trust. That's the word trust. So the heart of her husband trusts in her. And also heart is the little trigger there as well. Not just trust, but heart, because what's the next thing? Once you guys are yoked together, right? The next thing is that we now have a marriage. And so bait, the imagery behind bait is house, a home. That's the word bait in Hebrew is house or home. And so once they're married, then we're yoked, B, a home. So I'm able to kind of follow and memorize the poem. And so now the heart of my home is trust. I have trust as the heart of my home. And heart in Hebrew is labeb. That's the root. And it's spelled lamed bet or bait. And the Hebrew pictures or the word pictures behind that means the leader of two hearts. And you can take it either way. You could take, the leader of the two hearts that are being led, or the leader of the homes, or the leader of walking with God, the two hearts that are being led by God. But also think of, the heart of our home. The wife is usually the heart of the home. Think of so often, especially moms that stay home, we set the tone of our homes, whether we work or not, we set the tones of our homes. The Jewish mom had that child until they were about 12 years old. We poured, the moms poured into them. We teach them. We lay the foundation of religious thinking and teaching. We're the sensitive teaching ones, and then they're turned over to dad for more of the religious teaching at 12 and 13 years old. So, we set the tone. We set, are we going to have, the wild, fun, chaotic home, or are we going to have, the quiet, study home, routine, bedtimes? That's all us. That's all that we do.
And when you put this in perspective of the kind of homes they had back then, it was run by the patriarch. And so his wife, they would have many families living with them. And so it was, the matriarch and the patriarch, and then the homes were all connected in some fashion. And then there were common areas. And so it's very interesting when you talk about the two hearts then, and you said the homes, because that made me think of, well, it's also their son's home, their grandchildren's home that might even be connected to their son's home, who's connected to your home, so it's like this big community of family.
Well, we'll talk about in future, but when they were married, the wife went to his home. She joined his family. And so generally what happened was the son would be responsible for building a new addition or a new home, and the father, the patriarch, would say, okay, you're done. Go get your bride now. And so,
that's right.
That was all just kind of continuous building up of that little community. And so, the heart of the husband trusts in her. He is trusting so many aspects of it. And so this is really the first story that I put in here. For Aleph, I talk a little bit about myself and how my husband and I, that first couple of years of marriage, you have to learn how to work together as a husband and wife, and the zigzagging and everything. And then for the second person, I included a story of Samantha. And, Samantha shared that she had an affair. And usually it's we tend to think, oh, the guys have the affair, but she did. And how does the heart of her husband trust again when it's the woman who breaks the trust in that case? And so we go through the process of how they had to rebuild that trust. And when the trust is broken in a home, like, think about what is the biggest thing in our home that keeps our home going? Yes, the love. But, if we don't have a trust in our home,
right,
everything else is
right, yeah,
crumbles, right? The
yeah.
home.
If our children can't trust us, if our
Right.
husbands can't trust us, if we can't
We
trust
can't
them,
trust them. Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, that's the heart. What is really truly the heart? And then think about too, like, if we are yoking ourselves to God, the number one thing is, do we trust God? But also, do we live in such a way that he trusts us? We don't think about that. Like, it's always like, God, what can you do for me? What can you do for me? But do we live in an obedience that shows he can trust us? Like, we're always praying for an anointing. We're always praying for a gift, or we're always praying for a way to serve. But do we live in a way that shows that he can trust us as well? Are our hearts linked? Are we walking and being led? Are our two hearts linked?
And that you bring up such a good point, because when you go and you look at David, in the Bible, we see, we hear that he had a heart. God says he was a man after my heart, that we translated, but it was really that he had a heart like God's. And when God looked down at David, said, here's a man who has a heart just like me. He is a loyal person. He's going to be loyal to me. He's going to be loyal to the people I put him over, because he has a heart like mine. And I think that's a beautiful picture.
And yet, what was David's issue? David had extramarital affairs. David struggled as a parent, right? He had disobedient children. And yet he constantly said, search me, oh God, and redeem me, and give me a heart like you, and forgive me. And
he was always repentant,
and
always coming back to God. So.
Right. And so he has a heart that trusts God, but also he has behaviors that walk with God and build the trust in him. So, so I was able to begin to weave in some of my stories. I have stories for almost everybody, but Samantha is my first. So you can see, Aleph, yoke, bait, build the house. And so we'll get into Gimel is next, and that's an interesting one. But the Hebrew word for batak. So I put in here too, I thought this was interesting. This is on page 15, and it talks about the word batak is the Hebrew word trust. It begins with bet. Trust is strong. It means to adhere or weld. And it means a true weld. And I don't know if you guys know anything about welding. Like, we've heard this before. You can't tear it apart without, when a true weld is the strongest weld. It can't be separated. But also, when you are welded together and you separate something like that, pieces of you are remaining with, like, I don't know how to describe it. Like if you take a piece of paper and you're ripping it apart, parts of both are hanging on to both sides of that piece of paper. It's not like you're completely separated and there's no residue of each of you. So you still have residue of each of you that are connected. And so you're one, two become one. And I know in the creation gospel, that's a theme to look for, where you have 1, 2, 1, right? And so marriage is, we have 1 Adam, 2, but then they're one again. And so they're one, completely one. They're not two separates. Yeah.
You know what this reminds me of? Because I've been an anatomy teacher, and the ligaments grow from the cartilage, or I should say, collagen from the bone. So the ligaments actually grow right out of the bone to attach to another bone. And
wow.
It's very interesting because that's what makes them so strong. That's what keeps our skeleton together. Because if it weren't for the fact that the ligament at some point is bone and then becomes of an extension of that bone that goes and now wraps itself around at our fingers, at our joints, at our elbows and shoulders and legs. And so in bringing two separate bones together, that's what those ligaments do. And they tie them together so that they're one skeleton.
Okay. So you're describing that, and I'm thinking of, how the menorah was one and it's beaten out into multiple
one
branches,
piece of gold, right?
But it's all one piece of gold. And so you're describing that, and that's what I'm thinking of. Like, I know we're different parts, but we're one, and I just think that's amazing. Also that bait is number 2 in the Hebrew numeric system. But think about number 2. Number 2 is the first number that can be divided. And so that's important too. I put that in there. Trust can be divided. And, it's imperative as a yoked couple or a body of Christ or a bride of Christ to understand that number 2 can be divided.
Right.
And we definitely.
And you're right how that gives an opportunity for Satan to come in and divide.
Yeah. All right. Let's see if we have any questions on the back.
On page 13.
Okay.
You said that it's at the top of, I'm sorry, I said 13, I meant 19. Okay. I can't read, I guess. There are no perfect hearts, just like there are no perfect homes. God desires to use us even in our perfections. And that's what we were talking about with David and each of us, right? I can generally believe that when God searches humankind to find someone he can trust to fulfill his plan, he looks at the hearts of believers, which reflect our imperfect lives and our experiences. And I thought that was very well put, because he he even said that. He goes, King Saul was a big man who seemed strong, who was handsome. He looked like the obvious king, but God said, I look at the heart, not the outside. And David was a smaller man with red hair, that's why they describe him as Rudy, and so he was a totally different person, and yet he couldn't be king according to what everybody else thought.
So. I want to read a little further, because when we look at ourselves, we see flaws, blemishes, bruises, scars from very poor decisions and difficult lives. God looks at that. He strips away what we consider the flaws. He doesn't see them. He doesn't look at the outside. He looks at the heart, and he looks through our experiences. He makes his home in our heart, and he uses our experiences to develop the compassion, the forgiveness, and love, ultimately the trust in us that he can use us to reach others. And that was really the point. We are so quick to dump shame on us. And, Samantha, how does this happen to a God, a woman of God, right? How can how can she ever be used again? How can, this is the worst thing that could happen to a godly marriage or a woman. But, God doesn't look at that. Perhaps he looks at her heart and says, you know what, now you have compassion for women who may be in very similar situations. And nobody talks about this in the church, right? And so how often could someone be in the thick of this and save a marriage by saying, that it doesn't have to end in divorce. It doesn't have to end in destruction. It can end in God saving you and building that trust again.
It's very true. But that's also where forgiveness comes in, because without forgiveness, where would they be? This Samantha and her husband, if they didn't both, she had to forgive herself, but she had to forgive her husband in the sense of whatever she felt drove her to another man, not that it was right by any means, but there was something that drove her there. And then he had to forgive. And I think it's just goes without saying, but with all of our relationships, if we don't work from forgiveness of that person, then it's really hard for God to use us.
Right.
Because if we're walking around with unforgiveness, then that's a block.
Bitter. Yeah, it's bitterness. And it definitely can't root. Nothing can take root. Your heart cannot take root in bitterness. So yeah. All right. Well, how would you describe the tone of your home, Stephanie? What kind of home do you have?
Well, we have a Greek and we have an Italian. Sorry, not Italian, Irish. So we can be loud. Be loud. And I have to say that sometimes my kids just like, oh no. I mean, and it's not that we're arguing or fighting. No. It's just like, we just get like, what do you mean by that? Whatever. And it's like, no, I didn't mean that. Whatever. We just go back and forth about things. And then, we only have one child here, but he'll just kind of get up and be like, oh, there they go. They're kind of this discussion. But yeah. So, and I tell my kids, it's like, you were born into a loud family, honey. I can't, we just have to look at it as it's not a terrible thing.
Yeah.
It's just the way it is. That's who we are. It's how we are.
Yeah.
So even though we're, we love God, we love His Word, we try to live that out the best we possibly know how, but we're still loud and sometimes
definitely we're my family growing up was Italian and very boisterous, and I will say dysfunctional, right? And so we yelled. I mean, we argued and yelled. And I will say, my husband, the first time he met my family when we left, he's like, listen, if you talk to me like that, we're going to have problems, because they were harsh. And one of the rules in our house, even with our kids, is we don't yell to another room. Like, if you've got a question, you don't yell it across the house. You walk into the room and ask the question. Me growing up, man, we would just yell across the house. We just yelled. And so, that was, I had to learn how to have a different tone. Not to say we didn't have fun, not to say we didn't joke and laugh. And, we
exactly.
still,
our fun was loud too.
Yeah,
I mean, so
we could be boisterous, but I have been in other homes, like super quiet, super, played classical music. And I'm like, this is weird.
I had a mom ask me
loud music.
Yeah. But I had a mom ask me once when she dropped her kids off to play, she goes, so are you super picky? Like, am I going to have to worry about them breaking or, getting your carpet dirty or, she was just like, how strict are you? How picky are you? And I'm like, as long as they take off their shoes, they can run around the house. I'm not gonna, we're loud here too. So I'm not, so yeah, it was funny because she was used to other people and you had white carpet, white tablecloths, and you're inviting 10 children over, and it's like, okay, you have to stay here. You have to do this. You can't go in this room.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So, so I mean, everybody's different.
Yeah. It's okay. There are different tones in the home. It is okay. And depending on how many kids you have and stuff too. So
Right. I had 5 other sisters, so we walked around with barefoot on in our farm. I mean, yeah, so just very different from the house I have now, So
yeah. All right. So let's see. Because of life circumstances, is it hard to put your trust in others? And how has it affected trusting God? This is on page 20. Because sometimes people will put their understanding of God and how they have experienced family members, their own parents, their husband.
Exactly.
So sometimes it's hard to trust or fully trust in God based on life circumstances and things that we've experienced. So I don't know. I think it's easier for me. I had a hard time experiencing God as dad. I don't call him my dad because my dad is not a good example of that. And so I tend to not. However, of everyone that I trust God more than anyone because of human disappointments. So that's kind of had the opposite effect for me. If I'm going to trust anyone, it's going to be God first before people. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it does matter. I mean, even in Jewels of Hebrews, I wrote, "How do you see Jesus?" Because often it's how we see him is how we're going to treat him,
right?
And how we're going to treat our relationship with him,
right? And others sometimes too. Yeah.
Good questions, though.
All right. And then how does knowing you are a woman of strength affect your perception of whether you have the strength and ability to make changes in your heart needed to create trust in your home? That's a tough one. That was a hard question.
It is.
For a few reasons. Like, A, because I have to make the change. Like I can't depend on other people aren't always going to make that change. And so I'm going to have to be the one to make that change. Yeah. And, I have to trust in God to change the hearts of others because it's not going to be me. I'm not the Holy Spirit.
Right. And even as mothers, we change. I've changed a lot since I was a mother of elementary age kids. My patience level was not always very good. And I like to think that I've learned how to be more patient and more understanding since I've grown and matured. So
right. Definitely. All right. So that's really it for A and B, Aleph and Beit. If anybody that's watching has questions, you are welcome to add in anything that you guys had questions about or any specific comments that you had on those 2 chapters. I'll give you guys a second to jump in there. I will say that, and I kind of mentioned this before, the chapter, or not the chapters, the verses kind of go in chunks. So the first 3 is one kind of chunk, like the establishment of a home. And then she kind of leaves the home, and then there's this activity. And then there's a couple more that really get into the spiritual warfare aspect of it that we kind of talked about. So there's four verses or so that kind of talk about that. And then verses of how she interacts with her family. And so it's chunked. And I think that's interesting. We'll kind of get into that a little bit more. So these first 3 verses really just set up the establishment of this home. So Aleph and Beit, she's married. There's a home. Gimel, we'll talk about next week. It's a little more of establishing the home. And then when we get to Dalet is a door. So she's got to leave the home, and it kind of faces the creation. So these first 4 really kind of how she just gets things set up. So we'll talk a little bit more about Gimel and Dalet next week. Yeah.
The alphabet's very, very interesting. I do encourage people just to do a little bit of research on some of these letters when you're reading through, because there's a lot to learn. Their language is very deep and very layered. And
and we read it and it makes sense. Like once you realize what the letters mean, and then you kind of do a little bit of a word study in the verses, you're like, that's the letter. Like I see it. Like, who can find a virtuous woman? It doesn't make sense in English, but when I say a woman of strength, oh yeah, that's an ox. Like yoke yourself to the ox, right. Yoke yourself to the woman of strength. That makes sense. Okay. The heart of her husband. Okay. Well, the heart of my home is trust, right? And so I'm creating a home. So I can begin to see like, oh, now I can memorize it. And honestly, it does help with memorization.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the whole passage memorized, but when I'm in it and I'm working with it again, like I understand what the next one is benefit, because Gimel means benefit. Mm-hmm. And I know, I kind of understand what's next because I recognize the letters and I recognize the imagery of the letters. Right. So I don't have the entire passage memorized, but if I just knew the letters imagery, I could tell you what the verses are about. I don't have it word for word, but I know the theme of that verse and I can tell you what it is. So I'll challenge you to memorize some of it.
Yes. It's a good way.
Mm-hmm.
So very good. Well, thank you for sharing your book with us today and the next 10 or 12 weeks. I think that it's, it's good. Please go get it if you don't have it.
Yeah.
And join us because you won't be sorry. A lot of good topics and a lot of good conversation in it. So that we can have because of it.
Right.
So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking at some comments. I think we have a minute. Lori says, if your dad wasn't a good example of how a dad should be, why not call him dad? That's true. I mean, Yeshua, God, is definitely a much better example of a dad than just hard. Mm-hmm. It's hard to the trust aspect and abandonment. I was abandoned by my dad. So when I was older, so I knew him and, that those are things that definitely affect you in your life.
They do.
But God is faithful. He has not abandoned me. God is trustworthy. He has always proven himself faithful and trustworthy. So those are qualities that I absolutely appreciate in God, for sure. Yeah.
Yes.
All
absolutely.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll see you guys next Tuesday.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hugie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.